The first time I let myself think about it, really think about it, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this, complicated, dangerous, impossible. But there it was, lurking in every glance, every accidental brush of hands, every moment we lingered just a second too long. Ethan wasn't just my stepson. He was a storm I couldn't outrun. Society had rules for a reason, didn't it? Lines drawn to keep order, to protect hearts from chaos. Yet here we were, towing those lines until they blurred into something unrecognizable. Every stolen moment left me breathless, but aching with guilt. Was it wrong if it felt so right? Or was that just an excuse? I didn't have answers. Only questions that twisted tighter with each passing day. How far would we go before the weight of our secret crushed us? And more importantly, could we ever find our way back if we crossed the point of no return? This wasn't just love, it was a reckoning. One neither of us saw coming, yet neither of us could escape. It started subtly, a lingering glance here, a comforting touch there. Ethan had always been like a younger brother to me, someone I cared for deeply but never thought about beyond that role. He was Mark's son, my stepson, and our relationship had always been defined by polite affection and familial duty. But lately, something shifted, something I couldn't quite name, yet felt acutely in the quiet moments we shared. One evening, after dinner, I found him sitting alone on the porch, his silhouette framed by the fading light of dusk. His shoulders were slumped, his expression heavy, with unspoken thoughts. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, but he seemed lost in his own world. "You okay?" I asked softly, taking a seat beside him. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for answers in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, his words laced with vulnerability. "Everything feels off." My heart clenched at the raw honesty in his tone. This wasn't the confident young man I'd come to know over the years. This was someone struggling to find himself amidst chaos. Without thinking, I reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You're not alone, Ethan," I said, my voice steady despite the ache tightening my chest. "Whatever you're going through, we'll figure it out together." In the weeks that followed, we began spending more time together, talking late into the night, laughing over shared memories, and slowly unraveling pieces of ourselves we'd kept hidden from the world. We talked about everything: his dreams, his fears, the pressures he felt to live up to expectations that weren't even his own. And in return, I found myself opening up too, sharing parts of my life I hadn't dared to speak aloud before. Our bond grew stronger, deeper than either of us anticipated. What had once been simple familial care now felt charged with something else, something neither of us could fully understand or ignore. Each moment between us carried an undercurrent of intimacy, pulling us closer even as we tried to remind ourselves of the boundaries we were supposed to uphold. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, one truth became undeniable. Ethan wasn't just my stepson anymore. He was becoming something more, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The first time I noticed the shift, it hit me like a thunderclap, sudden, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. It happened during one of our late-night conversations, the kind where the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us cocooned in the dim light of the living room. Ethan leaned closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You're the only person who gets me," he said, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. I should have pulled away then. I should have reminded him, and myself, of the boundaries we were supposed to uphold. But instead, I stayed silent, frozen by the weight of his words and the unspoken emotions simmering between us. The moment stretched on, fragile and electric, until finally he looked down, breaking the spell. Yet even after he retreated into himself, the air around us remained charged, humming with something neither of us dared to name. Days turned into weeks, and that tension only grew stronger. Every accidental brush of his hand against mine sent shivers racing down my spine, each touch lingering longer than it should have. My mind screamed at me to put distance between us, to reinforce the walls we'd been taught never to cross. But my heart betrayed me, yearning for the connection we shared, a connection that felt deeper than anything I'd ever known. One night, as we sat side by side on the couch, the silence between us heavy with unspoken thoughts, Ethan broke it with a confession that left me reeling. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper but laced with raw honesty. His words hung in the air, reverberating through me like a seismic shockwave. Guilt warred with longing inside me, tearing me apart. This wasn't just familial affection or misplaced attachment. It was something far more dangerous, something that defied logic and reason. And yet, as much as I wanted to deny it, to push him away for both our sakes, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Because deep down, I felt it too, a pull so strong it scared me. The rain tapped insistently against the windows, a rhythmic patter that seemed to drown out the world beyond the house. Inside, the air felt heavy, charged with an electricity neither of us could ignore. We were alone, Mark working late as usual. And for the first time in weeks, there was no buffer between us, no distraction to diffuse the tension that had been building like a storm waiting to break. Ethan and I sat close on the couch, our knees almost touching. His presence filled the space around me, overwhelming yet intoxicating. "I shouldn't feel this way," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. His gaze locked onto mine, raw and unguarded, exposing emotions we'd both tried so hard to bury. Before I could respond, before logic could override impulse, he leaned forward, closing the distance between us. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but undeniably real. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to remind him of who we were supposed to be to each other. But my body betrayed me, leaning into his embrace instead, craving the warmth and closeness I'd denied myself for so long. What followed was a blur, a cascade of whispered confessions and stolen moments that left me breathless. Every touch carried a weight that defied explanation, every glance igniting something deep within me. We didn't cross every line, not yet, but the boundaries we'd clung to so desperately began to crumble under the intensity of what we shared. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, visceral, impossible to ignore or dismiss. When morning came, reality hit like a cold splash of water. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the room where hours earlier we'd surrendered to something we couldn't take back. Panic clawed at my chest as the consequences of our actions settled over me. "We can't let anyone find out," I said, my voice trembling with fear and guilt. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of regret and longing. "I know," he replied, his tone heavy with unspoken truths. But even as we acknowledged the danger, neither of us moved to create distance. The connection between us had grown too strong, too undeniable, to simply walk away from, even if walking away was exactly what we should have done. For weeks, we had been careful, meticulously so. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch was calculated, weighed against the risk of discovery. We told ourselves it was enough, that our secret was safe as long as we stayed vigilant. But secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to hold them. It started subtly, a suspicious glance from Rachel at a family barbecue. Her eyes lingered on Ethan and me longer than they should have, her smile polite but probing. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, a byproduct of the guilt I carried like a stone in my chest. But then came the whispers, fragments of conversations overheard when I wasn't supposed to be listening. "They're awfully close, don't you think?" someone murmured one evening after dinner. The words were casual, almost offhand, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach churned as I realized what they implied. Not just curiosity, but suspicion. Panic began to creep in, insidious and relentless. I found myself second-guessing every interaction between us, replaying moments in my mind to see if we'd slipped up, given too much away. Had we laughed too loudly, sat too close, let our hands brush once too often? The fear became a constant hum beneath my skin, making it hard to breathe, harder still to focus on anything else. One evening, as Ethan and I sat together in the living room, the weight of it all finally spilled out. He turned to me suddenly, his face pale, his expression taut with unease. "Someone knows," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch like an anchor. "Rachel. She said something today. Just a comment, really, but it felt pointed, like she's onto us." The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as fear gripped me, tightening around my chest like a vice. My mind raced, spinning through possibilities and worst-case scenarios. What would happen if someone found out? How far would the fallout reach? Would Mark ever forgive us? Could we even begin to explain something we didn't fully understand ourselves? "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling, though I already knew there were no easy answers. Ethan's jaw tightened, his gaze steady despite the storm brewing behind his eyes. "We protect each other," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No matter what." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with a resolve I hadn't realized I possessed. For all the danger we faced, for all the uncertainty looming ahead, one thing was clear: I couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything we'd shared. If protecting him meant lying, hiding, or fighting tooth and nail against anyone who tried to tear us apart, then so be it. But even as determination hardened within me, doubt lingered at the edges of my thoughts. Protecting each other sounded noble, heroic even, but what did that look like in practice? How could we possibly shield ourselves from the judgment of others, or worse, from the truth of what we'd done? The questions swirled endlessly, unanswered, leaving me dizzy with exhaustion. "We'll figure it out," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. It was less a statement of certainty and more a desperate plea to him, to myself, to whatever higher power might be listening. Ethan nodded, reaching for my hand. His touch was grounding, a reminder that no matter how dire things seemed, we weren't facing this alone. Together, we had weathered storms before, and though this one felt impossibly large, capable of swallowing us whole, I clung to the hope that somehow, some way, we'd find a way through. As the night wore on, silence settled between us, heavy but not unbearable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and casting eerie shadows across the walls. I wanted to believe we could keep our secret buried, that we could outrun the suspicions circling us like vultures. But deep down, I knew better. Secrets always come to light, eventually. The only question was whether we'd be ready when ours did. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, catching me off guard in the worst possible way. It happened at a party, loud music, clinking glasses, and forced laughter filling the air, but none of it could drown out the tension that gripped me when Rachel cornered me by the kitchen. Her tone was sharp, laced with accusation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "There's something going on between you and Ethan, isn't there?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. I froze, my mind racing for a response, but every excuse felt hollow, every denial futile. She already suspected too much. Instead, I forced a laugh, trying to mask the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, though my voice wavered, betraying me despite my best efforts. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she turned away, leaving me shaken. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, each smile and nod feeling like a performance I couldn't quite pull off. By the time we got home, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me like a physical force. Later that night, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the dimly lit living room. The silence between us was heavy, charged with everything we hadn't yet said. Finally, I broke it, my voice trembling as tears streamed down my face. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, the words ripping through me even as I spoke them. Ethan looked at me, his expression raw with emotion. "But I can't lose you," he countered, his voice breaking under the weight of his own despair. My heart ached at the pain in his eyes, mirroring the turmoil inside me. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that we'd find a way to fix this, but how could I promise something I wasn't sure of? "We'll figure it out," I said finally, the words sounding weak even to my own ears. But they were all I had. For now, they would have to be enough. In the days that followed, we talked endlessly, our voices low and measured, as if afraid the walls might hear. Each conversation circled the same questions. Could we keep going like this? Should we risk everything, our family, our reputations, our sanity, for something so fragile, so forbidden? The weight of it all pressed down on us, suffocating in its intensity. Every glance between us felt loaded, every accidental brush of hands electric with memories we were trying to bury. Ultimately, we decided to step back. It wasn't a choice made lightly. It was born out of necessity, an acknowledgement that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, not because they don't feel right, but because the cost is too high. We owed it to Mark, to ourselves, to try to rebuild what we'd shattered. But even as we agreed, the ache of separation lingered, sharp and unrelenting. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan broke the silence. "We'll always have this," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. His eyes met mine, searching for reassurance I wasn't sure I could give. "Even if we can't act on it." I nodded slowly, my throat tight with emotion. Reaching for his hand one last time, I let myself feel the warmth of his touch before pulling away. "Always," I whispered, the word carrying more weight than I intended. It was a promise, a fragile, bittersweet vow to carry what we'd shared without letting it consume us. Yet, as I walked away that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that stepping back didn't mean letting go. Some connections transcend boundaries, leaving marks too deep to erase. And though we chose to protect our world from the truth, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how far apart we drifted, Ethan would always hold a piece of me. Love isn't always simple or safe. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and terrifying, so tangled up in emotions you can't untangle them, no matter how hard you try. But even in its messiness, love has a way of carving out spaces within us that nothing else can touch. As Ethan and I navigated the uncertain terrain of our new reality, a fragile truce built on boundaries we'd redrawn, I realized something profound. Some connections transcend logic. They defy explanation because they're rooted in something deeper than reason, something primal and undeniable. Our bond had been forbidden from the start, a collision of feelings neither of us chose, but couldn't escape. It wasn't just attraction, it was understanding, trust, and a shared vulnerability that made the world feel less lonely for both of us. Even now, with distance between us, I could still feel the echo of his presence, the warmth of his hand brushing mine, the intensity of his gaze holding mine like an anchor in stormy seas. We had chosen to let go, to protect ourselves and those around us, but letting go didn't mean forgetting. The memory of what we shared would stay with me forever, not as a burden, but as a testament to the complexity of human connection. It wasn't about regret, it was about acceptance. What Ethan and I had was real, even if it existed outside the lines society drew for us. And though we walked away from each other physically, emotionally, there was no erasing the mark he left on my heart, or the quiet ache of knowing we'd never truly be free of what we'd felt. In moments of stillness, when the house was quiet and my thoughts drifted, I wondered if things might have been different under other circumstances. But life doesn't offer do-overs, only choices, and we'd made ours. For now, that would have to be enough. Months later, life began to settle into a fragile rhythm, like the first tentative notes of a song after a long silence. The sharp edges of our secret had softened with time, though they still lingered in the quiet moments when Ethan and I found ourselves alone together. We worked hard to rebuild what we'd broken, not as lovers, but as two people bound by shared history and an unshakable connection. It wasn't easy. Every word, every glance carried the weight of everything we'd been through. But slowly, trust started to take root again, steady and deliberate, where passion had once burned too brightly. We focused on small things, shared laughter over dinner, stolen conversations about books or music, the kind of mundane exchanges that reminded us how much we still meant to each other. There was no pretense anymore, no hiding behind half-truths or forced smiles. Just honesty, raw and imperfect, holding us together even when the uncertainty threatened to pull us apart. Mark remained oblivious, his presence in the house unchanged, and for that, I was grateful. Some wounds didn't need to be exposed to heal. Still, there were nights when sleep eluded me, my mind drifting back to the choices we'd made and the boundaries we'd crossed. I wondered if we'd ever truly move past it all, or if we even should. Yet, amidst the lingering questions, I clung to hope. Not the reckless, desperate kind that had driven us before, but something quieter, steadier. A belief that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to carry it without letting it define us. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan joined me on the porch. He sat beside me, close enough for our shoulders to brush lightly, and said nothing at first. Then, almost hesitantly, he spoke. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling guilty about this?" I turned to look at him, his profile outlined against the fading light. For a moment, I didn't answer. When I finally did, my voice was soft but sure. Maybe not, but maybe guilt isn't the worst thing to live with if it means we're doing better. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, and I felt a flicker of peace, a fragile, fleeting sense that we might actually find our way forward. Together, whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. We would face it side by side, just as we always had. And somehow that was enough.